Be me, Beth. 28 years old, living in a major city. I'm a writer for a popular online magazine. You've probably seen our stuff. We mostly write articles about culture, society, and relationships. My specialty, my bread and butter, is writing about modern dating and the patriarchy. Specifically, how toxic masculinity ruins everything for everyone. I'm good at it. My articles get a lot of clicks, a lot of shares. I believed I was doing important work, shining a light on the subtle ways men's behavior holds society back. The world, as I saw it, was a straightforward equation. One Tuesday morning, or maybe it was a Wednesday, I get called into my editor's office. The office is all glass and minimalist furniture, very chic, very sterile. My editor is a man in his late 40s, a guy who wears expensive sneakers with his blazers. He gestures for me to sit down, a smug little smile on his face. He thinks he's on the cutting edge of culture, but he's really just good at monetizing outrage. On his giant monitor are a bunch of charts and graphs. He taps the screen. Look at this, Beth. This is our next big story. The charts show a steep decline in male users on every major dating app over the last 2 years. Another graph shows a corresponding spike in the number of single, childless women aged 25-35. Marriage rates are in the toilet. Birth rates are even worse. He explains that there's a growing phenomenon of men just checking out. They're not protesting, not making a big scene. They're just quietly vanishing from the dating market. He calls it the Great Resignation, but for relationships. My editor sees a gold mine. He gives me the assignment, a feature article, a deep dive into this trend. The title he pitched was something like The Peter Pan Plague, Why Men Are Refusing to Grow Up. The angle was predetermined. I was to portray these men as entitled man-children, losers who couldn't handle a world with empowered women. They were to be painted as sore losers in the game of life, retreating to their basements because they couldn't compete. I loved it. It fit perfectly with everything I already believed. It felt like the logical, pathetic conclusion of toxic masculinity. I told him I was on it, already picturing the pithy headlines and sarcastic takedowns. Later that evening, I met up with my friend Maya for coffee. Maya is different from my other friends. She's practical, grounded. She's been with her boyfriend for 5 years. They're normal. They fix things around their apartment together. They have a dog. They talk about the future without any drama. I always found their relationship a little boring, a little too traditional for my taste. I tell her about my new assignment, my voice dripping with the irony I planned to put into the article. I explained how I was going to expose this movement of pathetic guys who can't handle rejection. Maya just sipped her latte and listened patiently. She didn't get excited like I expected. Instead, she looked thoughtful. She told me her boyfriend had been talking about this for a while. According to him, a lot of his friends were done with dating, not because they were angry, but because they were exhausted. She said he described modern dating for an average guy as a second job you have to pay for, where you're constantly interviewed for a position you'll probably never get, and you're treated with suspicion from the very start. She mentioned that they felt like one wrong move, one misunderstood joke, could get them labeled as a creep or worse. I just laughed. I told her that was just the sound of privilege being dismantled. That's what equality feels like when you're used to being on top. She just shrugged and said, maybe. Or maybe they just did the math and realized it's a bad deal. I dismissed her comment completely. A bad deal? What a ridiculous way to look at human connection. My plan was simple. Go undercover. I couldn't just interview these guys. They wouldn't be honest with a journalist, especially one with my byline. I needed to observe them in their natural habitat. So I created a fake profile on a hobby finder app, not a dating app. The idea was to find groups where these resigned men would congregate. I figured they'd be into stereotypically male things, video games, tabletop RPGs, stuff like that. But I wanted something less online, more tangible. I found a local group dedicated to restoring vintage motorcycles and machinery. It sounded perfect, greasy, loud, and full of men who probably thought feminism was a swear word. My profile was carefully crafted, a friendly but non-threatening picture, a bio that said I was new to the city and wanted to learn a practical skill. I got an invite to their weekly meetup almost immediately. It was held in a massive shared garage space on the industrial side of town, the kind of place that smells permanently of oil, sawdust, and old coffee. I walked in that first Saturday afternoon feeling like an anthropologist discovering a lost tribe. There were about a dozen guys there, ranging in age from their early 20s to their late 60s. They were working on various projects. A half-disassembled motorcycle engine on one workbench, a classic car frame on another. The atmosphere was calm, focused. Just the sound of tools, quiet conversation, and classic rock playing softly from a dusty radio. I saw him then. Ethan. He wasn't the alpha of the group, not the loudest or biggest guy. He was maybe around 30, quietly focused on meticulously cleaning a carburetor. He had a calm, steady presence. I decided he would be my primary target. I walked over, put on my friendliest smile, and introduced myself. I told him I knew nothing about engines, but was eager to learn. He looked up, gave me a polite but brief smile, and introduced himself. He showed me what he was doing, explained the function of the part in his hands in simple terms. His explanation was clear, patient. He was a good teacher. Then I started my move. I leaned in a little closer than necessary. I laughed a little too loudly at a small joke he made. I touched his arm lightly when I asked a question. Standard, time-tested flirting techniques. Absolutely nothing. It was like throwing a pebble into a black hole. He registered the gesture. I could see it in his eyes for a split second, and then he just ignored it. He finished his explanation and then turned his full attention back to the carburetor. The conversation was over. He hadn't been rude, but he had put up a wall of polite indifference that was more effective than any insult. I tried with a few other guys. The reaction was the same across the board. They were perfectly willing to talk about the work. They'd offer me a soda, show me how a tool worked, answer any technical questions. But the second I tried to pivot the conversation to something personal, to flirt, it was like a switch flipped. Their eyes would glaze over. Their answers would become short. They'd find a reason to go back to their project. I spent 3 hours there and left feeling deeply, profoundly confused and angry. I had been dismissed, not rejected. That implies they considered and then refused. This was worse. I hadn't even been considered. I was just background noise. This wasn't what I expected. I was looking for angry, bitter men. Men who would complain about women. These guys weren't angry at all. They were just content. They didn't seem to need or want my attention. It was unsettling. It completely contradicted my article's thesis. I went home and wrote furious notes, trying to spin what I saw. Their shared hobbies are a coping mechanism, a fortress built to hide from female intimacy. Their politeness is a passive-aggressive shield against emotional engagement. It sounded weak, even to me. I decided I needed to be more direct. The next weekend, I went back to the garage. This time, I was on a mission. No more subtle flirting. I found Ethan working on the same motorcycle. I walked right up to him and decided to just call it out. I started the conversation casually, asking about his progress on the bike. He was polite, as before. Then I dropped the bomb. So, what's the deal with this place? Is this some kind of no girls allowed club? He didn't even look up from his work. Anyone is allowed. You're here, aren't you? I pressed on. That's not what I mean. I mean, Everyone here seems to be running from something. What is it? Scared of strong women?" That finally got him to pause. He slowly put down his wrench, wiped his hands on a rag, and looked at me. There was no anger in his eyes, just a kind of tired curiosity. He told me I was looking at it all wrong. He explained that nobody was running from anything. They were walking towards something. He said, "Here, my effort equals results. It's a simple, fair transaction." He pointed at the engine block. "I put in 100 hours of careful work. I get a perfectly running engine. I know the rules, and the machine plays by them. It's predictable. It's honest." He looked me straight in the eye. He then said that dating, for him and many others, had become the opposite of that. It felt like an endless series of moving goalposts, unwritten rules, and high-stakes tests you didn't know you were taking. He described it as a game where the rules could change at any moment, without warning, and the penalty for losing was catastrophic. He wasn't talking about just a bad date. He was talking about losing your reputation, your friends, your money, your future. I tried to argue. I brought up the patriarchy, emotional labor, all my usual talking points. He just listened, nodding slightly, as if I were a kid explaining the rules of a make-believe game. When I finished my rant, he just said, "That all sounds very complicated and exhausting." He told me he had a limited amount of time and energy in his life. He could spend it here, building something real and getting a clear, positive return on his investment. Or he could spend it navigating the labyrinth I had just described, with a very high chance of failure and a very high cost. He said he simply chose the better investment. It wasn't about hate or fear. It was just simple, practical math. Then he picked up his wrench and went back to work. The conversation was over. I stood there for a full minute, completely speechless. His logic was so simple, so direct, it was almost insulting. He had taken this incredibly complex social issue I'd built my career on and reduced it to a cost-benefit analysis, like choosing a brand of motor oil. I felt a rage building inside me. He was wrong. He had to be wrong. This wasn't logic. This was a cowardly excuse, wrapped up in a neat little package of faux rationality. But a tiny, poisonous seed of doubt had been planted in my mind. His calmness was what got to me. He wasn't lashing out. He wasn't defensive. He sounded like a man who had genuinely weighed his options and made a peaceful, deliberate choice. He sounded free. My direct approach had been a complete failure. I needed a new strategy. I decided to stop trying to extract information and just become part of the scenery. I kept going back to the garage every weekend for the next month or so. I'd bring a 6-pack of beer or a box of donuts. I learned how to use a wrench without stripping the bolt. I mostly just listened. They accepted my presence. I was just Beth, the writer girl who was weirdly interested in old engines. They never asked about my work, and I never offered. I started getting invited to their other social events, which were mostly just low-key barbecues at someone's house. It was at one of these barbecues that everything finally clicked into place. The vibe was completely different from any co-ed party I'd ever been to. There was no posturing. No one was trying to impress anyone. The guys were grilling, talking shit about sports teams, showing off a new tool they'd bought. It was comfortable. There was an easy camaraderie, a sense of belonging that I hadn't expected. They weren't performing for female attention because there was none to compete for except mine, and I had already been mentally filed away as a non-participant. I noticed one of the older guys, a man named Floyd, seemed off. He was quiet, staring into the fire pit with a hollow look in his eyes. A few of the other men would go over to him one by one. They wouldn't say much. One would just hand him a beer. Another would just sit next to him in silence for a few minutes, clap him on the shoulder, and then walk away. It was a quiet, powerful display of support. No one was asking him to open up or talk about his feelings. They were just being present. Later, I got to talking with one of the younger guys in the group. I asked him what was going on with Floyd, and he told me. Floyd had been married for over a decade. He was a good husband, a great father to his 2 kids. He wasn't a millionaire, but he was a hard worker, a provider. He did everything he was told a good man was supposed to do. A few months ago, his wife came to him and said she was unhappy. Not that he'd done anything wrong, just that she wasn't feeling fulfilled. She wanted a divorce. Floyd was devastated, but he tried to be amicable. He suggested counseling. She refused. Then the lawyers got involved. His wife's lawyer advised her to claim he was emotionally abusive. There was no proof, no evidence, just the accusation. But it was enough. The court sided with her on almost everything. She got the house that he had spent 15 years paying the mortgage on. She got primary custody of the kids. He was allowed to see them every other weekend. He was ordered to pay a crippling amount in alimony and child support, so much that he had to move into a tiny apartment and get a second job just to make ends meet. The guy telling me the story shook his head. He said Floyd wasn't just broke, he was broken. He had built his entire life around his family, and in the span of 6 months, it was all taken away from him. He followed all the rules of the game, and he was punished for it anyway. The young man looked over at Floyd, who was still staring into the fire. "We all look at him," he said, his voice low, "and we all learn. We all see what happens when you put your life in someone else's hands. The legal system is not your friend. A marriage license is not a partnership. It's a contract that is heavily weighted against you." He looked back at me. "So when you see us here, working on our bikes and keeping to ourselves, it's not because we hate women. We're just not willing to play a game that's rigged against us. Floyd is our ghost of Christmas future." That was it. That was the moment my entire worldview shattered. It was a physical sensation, like a pane of glass cracking in my chest. Ethan's words came flooding back to me. The penalty for losing is catastrophic. It's just simple, practical math. It wasn't about toxic masculinity. It wasn't about men being afraid of strong women. It was about risk. These men saw modern relationships, and particularly marriage, as an unacceptable risk. They had looked at the potential rewards, companionship, a family, and weighed them against the potential consequences, losing their children, their homes, their financial future, their reputation. And they had made a rational decision to opt out. They weren't angry incels. They were risk-averse investors in a volatile market. They had created their own support systems, their own communities, their own sources of meaning and fulfillment. They didn't need the system that I was a part of, and they were thriving without it. I felt dizzy. My entire career, all the articles I'd written, all the beliefs I held so dear, they all felt like a lie. I had been so sure of my moral high ground, so certain that I understood the world. But I had never once stopped to consider the view from the other side. Not really. I'd only ever seen men as a collective, as the patriarchy, a monolithic source of oppression. I had never seen them as individuals making calculated decisions to protect themselves. I left the barbecue without saying goodbye to anyone. I went home and sat in my dark apartment for hours. I thought about my own dating life, the endless swiping, the men I'd dismissed for petty reasons, the adversarial dynamic I brought to every first date, looking for red flags instead of green ones. I realized that I, too, was part of the problem. I was one of the unwritten rules, one of the moving goalposts Ethan had talked about. The next Monday, I walked into my editor's office. He looked up from his screen, that same smug smile on his face. "Beth, perfect timing. I need that draft by Friday. The art department is already working on a graphic of a grown man in a diaper, holding a video game controller." I stood in front of his desk. "I can't write it," I said. My voice was quiet, but steady. His smile vanished. "What do you mean, You can't write it? The angle is wrong, I said. It's all wrong. They're not man-children. They're not scared. They're making a choice, a logical one, based on the risks involved. I tried to explain what I'd seen. I told him about the garage, about the community, about Floyd. I told him that the real story wasn't about men's failures, but about the failure of the system we've built around relationships. He stared at me, his eyes narrowing. He wasn't listening. He was processing how this affected his bottom line. When I finished, he just leaned back in his expensive chair and laughed. A short, ugly bark of a laugh. Oh, Beth, you got too close. You went native. He told me that nobody wanted to read that story. That story doesn't get clicks. Rage gets clicks. Blame gets clicks. Men being pathetic gets clicks. Our readers want to be told they're right, he said. They don't want to be challenged. Your job is to give them what they want. My job is to tell the truth, I shot back. No, he said, his voice turning cold. Your job is to write the story I assign you. Write the damn article, or you can clean out your desk. I looked at him, at his minimalist office, his expensive sneakers. I thought about the men in the garage, covered in grease, building something real with their own hands. I thought about Floyd, and I made my choice. I told him where he could shove his article. 15 minutes later, I was walking out of the building with my belongings in a cardboard box. I had lost my job, my career, my entire professional identity. I got home, dropped the box on the floor, and just stood in the middle of my living room. I felt strangely calm, lighter even. I had no idea what I was going to do next, but I knew one thing for sure. I opened my personal laptop, the old one I used for non-work stuff. I went to a forum, an anonymous, chaotic place where people spoke their minds without fear, and I started to write. I didn't use any of my journalistic flair. No witty headlines, no clever metaphors. I just told the story, exactly as I had experienced it. I used the green text format. Be me, journalist, sent to write a hit piece on men who don't date anymore. I wrote about the garage, about Ethan's simple logic, about the barbecue, about Floyd's story. I laid it all out, fact by fact, without any judgment or analysis. I ended the post with a simple line. I went looking for pathetic man-children. Instead, I found men who had simply done the math. I was fired for refusing to write the article they wanted. Now I don't know what to believe. I hit submit, and then I watched. For the first few minutes, nothing. Then the replies started to come in. 1, then 10, then 100. They were from men all over the world. They weren't gloating. They weren't saying, I told you so. They were just sharing. Story after story pouring in. My brother-in-law is Floyd. I was almost Floyd. This is why I'm focusing on my business instead. This is why I spend my weekends hiking alone. It was a flood, an outpouring of quiet resignation, of shared experience. Thousands of men, all saying the same thing in different ways. The thread was raw, honest, and heartbreaking. I scrolled through the replies for hours, a lump forming in my throat. Then I saw the top comment, the one with the most upvotes. It wasn't angry. It wasn't bitter. It was just 5 simple words. Thank you for finally listening. I closed my laptop. The world outside my window was the same, but my perception of it had been permanently altered. I had lost my job, but I had found a truth I never knew existed. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I could finally see clearly.